Hello and welcome to the video where we're going to be looking at this sculpture which I've put together. This has taken a little bit of time to put together, as you may have noticed. I'm calling this Within the Void We Are Restless, possibly referencing the demon creature here, which is sort of exploding out of a summoning circle and attacking a steampunk angel. Now, you've probably seen part one of this, and this is obviously quite a complex sculpture which has taken me quite a long time to put together. But in this video we're going to be looking at how I put this together, primarily focusing on the construction of the final parts of the project. I'm going to be making some moulds of the sort of demon character and also painting the angel as well. So let's get started. So this is where we got to at the end of the previous video, and as you can see there's still a fair amount to do. I need to finish off the angel sculpture. She needs some hands and another wing and another leg as well, also needs to be painted. The demon character is in a slightly less finished state as well. Really need to finish off exactly how that's going to look. I also need to mould and cast it, because of course this thing is in monster clay and that can't be the final sculpture, so I'm going to need to make a mould, cast it up in resin, which for the shape that this demon character is and the size of the column of arms is no small undertaking, so that's a whole project in of itself. So the first aspect I want to have a look at is another wing for the angel character, and I had put together this perspex wing here, as you can see, and this wasn't really meant to be a final piece. It was sort of there as a placeholder really, just to give an idea. And once I had sculpted up the feathered wing, it was pretty clear that this wing wouldn't match what I'd already done, so I needed to make the wing larger. As you can see, what I've got in the left hand side is much smaller than the sculpted wing on the right, so I need to do something that's sort of similar in size and sort of would match. The idea is that the angel has been injured in the past, I guess, and so she's had one of her wings replaced with a mechanical prosthesis, I suppose. Same for the arm, so I'm trying to do something that will match. And in order to do that, I'm going to sort of scratch build a mechanical looking thing. So I've raided my bits box to see what I've got, and what I've done is to pull out this lighter which I used way back when for the mech project that some of you may have seen. I think this looks quite nice as a sort of a junction point on the wing here, so I'm going to try and incorporate that. Now, the difficulty with using a found object like this is that the lighter is hollow, and in the previous project I had made a mould of it, but I'm not sure what I did with the mould. I have a feeling I might have actually cut it up, so I'm stuck with the original, which is fine, but obviously that does present some problems because it's not a hard piece of resin. There's cavities in it, it's held together with screws, things like that. So what I'm going to do here in order to secure the lighter to this brass tube is to actually pour some resin into the cavity in the lighter, put the brass tube inside and then let that set. So that should harden and hold it in place. It's a little bit of risk here because once I've done this I'm not going to be able to put it out again, so I need to make sure that I get the orientation correct. So I'm just trying to make sure here that everything looks okay before the resin's set. I've got a minute or so to play with it before it fully sets, so I've got some time to play with. Right, so that's set, so that was pretty good. What I've also got is this, which I also made for a previous project as well. So I'm quite lucky in a sense that I've got quite a lot of mechanical pieces which I've already put together, which I can incorporate into this section. I've also got some pieces from radio control cars, which are quite useful as well. So I'm just trying to build this up into a final mechanical wing. I'm also going to incorporate a jet engine, which is something I made for another mech project as well. So, you know, I'm at that stage now where I've done so many projects in the past that I've got moulds of loads of different mechanical bits and pieces which I can use to incorporate into this project. Now that can be a bit of a double-edged sword because it can make your projects look a little bit samey if you're not too careful, so I'm trying to do this sparingly. Nevertheless, it is a bit of a time saver if you've got like a jet engine that you can just use in any projects you need, or, you know, mechanical junctions and things like that. So I've got a lot of pieces like that, which makes this quite an easy process. Right, so there's the jet engine added, and that's not looking too bad. Now, I initially thought that this would be the wing, but after a while I sort of came back to it and thought, yeah, you know, maybe I need to make a little bit more effort with it. So I decided to actually put a bit more effort into this, and I didn't video a lot of this, I'm afraid, but what I've done is to make up some shapes out of car body filler and further pieces of acrylic to make some feathers, effectively. So I'm now turning my attention to the demon character. Now, because he's got this sort of unique armature inside, which if you remember back from part 1 is made of steel in order to support the weight of the angel on his arm. So what that means is I can actually put some steel bar into the socket which he would normally sit on the column of arms with. And what I've done is to put that in some bearings to allow me to rotate the sculpture. So what I'm going to do here in order to make my mould is to get some silicone on him, and as the silicone drips down I'm going to rotate the sculpture, and that will allow the silicone to keep flowing over the body. Now obviously you can see some's dripping off straight back into the bucket there, but I figure if I just keep rotating this, as the silicone cures it's going to slowly slow down, and that's going to allow me to build up a thick jacket of silicone around the sculpture. Now this is a very complicated shape. There's lots of indentations and lots of space for air bubbles here. And because of this detail in the sculpture, I'm using an airbrush to try and blow the silicone into those details to try and pick them up in the resin. As you can see, he doesn't have a hand or a foot. I'm actually planning on sculpting those separately, simply because it would make the mould very, very complicated if I had hands and feet in there. So I'm going to do those as add-ons to the final resin piece. But because I plan to work on this after I've cast it, I'm not worrying too much about the possibility of air bubbles. I know I'm going to have to do some cleanup on this sculpture. I know I'm going to have to do some additions, namely the hand and foot, but also probably a load of other bits as well. I want to have a lot of other arms coming out of this sort of fleshy mass on its side. So I'm viewing this as sort of an intermediary, really. I'm just changing the monster clay sections into resin, and then I've got a firm, solid shape that I can then work on and add additional detail as well. Okay, so now I've got a full layer over the model. I can be a little bit less careful with it in a sense. So what I'm doing now is adding on a layer of silicone which is thickened up with a thixotropic agent, so it turns into a bit of a paste, and I'm pasting that over the sculpture to build up the thickness of the silicone. Right, so the silicone's dried and I've jumped ahead a little bit here. I've put a fiberglass case over this, and that's a hard case which is going to keep the soft silicone in shape once I've taken the sculpture out. So I've done the first half of that, so what I'm going to do is pull away my cardboard surround and make a second fiberglass case on the back. Jumping ahead, that's what I've done here, so I'm just levering that open. And what I can do now is very carefully cut through the silicone to release the sculpture. Now, as you can see, I've moulded this with some steel bars in place, and the reason for that is that when I cast this I want to have the steel bars in place to hold the armature in the correct orientation, and also obviously to stop resin getting into the socket, so that isn't filled and I can continue using it. So that's why they're there. Right, so there we go, so I've cut the mould open and I've freed my sculpture. And upsetting as it is, I can now pull my sculpture apart. The reason for that is I need to free the armature that's inside, so I need to put that back in the mould for the casting process. So the armature inside this will be embedded in resin once I've cast this, which is kind of handy as well. It just adds a further degree of strength to it. The steel was obviously pretty strong, but having a bit more on top of that certainly helps. And as you may recall, right at the beginning I covered the armature in parcel tape, and that was just so I didn't have monster clay stuck all over it, so that's come out quite cleanly. So I can cut down the aluminium armature that I've wired to it, and I can now put that back in the mould. So that's how that's going to sit. Now, I'll be honest, I did have some leaks in my mould when I poured my resin in, part of the reason for that is because, like I said, I didn't take a lot of care over this. I took some care, but perhaps not as much as you might in other situations. But I just rolled with it. Obviously as the resin cures, the leak slows down. But what I did also was to throw this in the pressure chamber as well, because there was so much detail, particularly in that fleshy part on his side. There is the possibility for air bubbles. Like I said, I know I have some, but if I pressure cast it, that's going to help me avoid some of those as well. So that's what I've done here. So this is quite interesting. I put my sculpture in the pressure chamber, like I say, to try and avoid air bubbles. But because the silicon mould that I made by pouring the silicon onto the sculpture, I think I must have introduced some air bubbles into the silicon as I did that. I did degas it before I put it on there. But nevertheless, I think there were some in the cavity, because what you can see here is that there are some kind of basically pinpricks sticking out of my sculpture. Some of them are quite large, others are a bit smaller, and in a sense I don't really mind that. They kind of look kind of like warts, But what's happened here is that a air bubble in the silicon has collapsed under pressure, and that's formed a deformation effectively in the silicon, which the resin has run into. So as you can see, like on the shoulder here, a cavity in the silicon has collapsed, and that's caused a projection on the surface of the resin. It kind of looks quite natural, really. They look a little bit gross, a little bit like warts. So I might retain some of these, but for others, I think I'll just file those off. So I'm just grinding some of those off with the Dremel here. And what I'm also doing, because I used a toothbrush to introduce some texture onto the skin of the sculpture that was in the monster clay, I'm going to have to replicate that texture back in the resin where I file things away. So what I'm doing is just scratching the resin here with some coarse sandpaper, and that's just to reintroduce some texture into the surface, so that should look a little bit like skin texture, hopefully. And as I mentioned, definitely got some air bubbles here, so I'm just using a Dremel to get rid of those as well. Okay, so now that I've got my sculpture in resin rather than monster clay, I can now start adding bits to it. So as you can see, I've got the arm, which is going to be grabbing the angel in the shoulder there, and that goes in with the steel socket, which I mentioned. But what I also want to do is add some additional arms to the sculpture as well. So I've got a few here. I've got one which is sculpted entirely in epoxy, and two which are moulded in resin. And what I want to do is just glue these on to give him some additional limbs, so he's got this kind of weird, deformed, kind of monstrous appearance, and that's going to tie in with the column of arms that he's sort of appearing from the base. As you can see on one of these arms, I've actually given it 6 fingers as well, and I did that just by cutting up some additional copies of that arm and gluing them together. So the way that I did this was to sculpt up 2 arms in epoxy, and I then made a mould of both, and that allowed me to run off loads and loads of casts in resin, which I could then use as is, or I could sort of reshape depending on what I needed. And so obviously the column of arms is going to have loads sticking out of it, and so I did need a lot of copies, and obviously it would have taken ages to actually sculpt these from scratch, and so for that reason I made some moulds. I also need to give him a hand on his left arm, so I'm just cutting a hand off from another cast, and I'm going to glue that on. No sense sculpting that from scratch if I can use something I've already done, so that's what I'm going to do here. I'm now turning my attention to the column of arms, and although I've got some detail on here, I've got quite a lot to add. So what I've done is to use a technique I've shown in previous videos, which is to throw some monster clay, some molten monster clay, into cold water, and that gives you some really interesting organic shapes which you can then use for your sculptures. So I'm just basically creating a collage of monster clay pieces here to build up the organic looking detail of the sculpture. I also mentioned a technique in the previous part of this video where you can melt the clay with a blowtorch and then blast it with water from a hose. And that's sort of a similar technique to pouring molten monster clay into the water. The cold water will cause the monster clay to sort of freeze in organic shape, So it's quite a nice way of getting sort of random organic looks into the sculpture without having to actually sculpt them. So what I'm also going to do is use some casts of my arms, which I've got here, and then sort of further dress the sculpture with these. In the final piece, these are going to be held on with magnets. They're quite delicate, I suppose, so you don't want them to get caught on things when you're moving it about. So what I'm doing is just placing these in place and trying to, again, build up a bit of a collage of arms to give it that sort of monstrous look. Alright, so that's where we are, and I'm quite liking the look of that. Lots of grasping arms kind of reaching out. Right, so now time to mould this, and this isn't really different to any other mould really of this type. You know, I'm dripping silicone over the shape and slowly building up a layer of silicone to pick up all that detail. What I'll then do is put a fiberglass over it to build up a hard case. The only difference here really is the size of the thing. Obviously this is quite a big piece, so it's going to take quite a lot of silicone. But it's really just a case of taking your time with it and just slowly building it up in the same way as you would anything else. Again, I'm using the airbrush to blow air into the detail, so there's fewer air bubbles as possible. I mean, one difficulty with this though is because it's so big and it is quite heavy, it's quite difficult to rotate in the way that I was with the demon character previously. So in this case, I'm literally just having to scrape the silicone back off the base and reintroduce it further up. Got there in the end, so what I can now do is build a cardboard surround around the piece, and that will allow me to make my fiberglass jacket to hold the silicone in place. So now that's finished, I can make my fiberglass jacket, and that's just a case of laminating the fiberglass with polyester resin. So now that's all dry, I can now pull this apart, and same with the demon sculpture, I can then cut the mould open, and then I'll put the silicone back in the fiberglass case, and we'll start pouring some resin in. Right, so there we go, so there's my jacket mould, and because of all of these bits of monster clay in sort of weird and wonderful shapes, there was quite a lot stuck in the mould, so it took a little bit of time to actually clean that out. But once I'd done that, I was ready to go. Now, of course, the same as the demon character, I need to get the armature out of the sculpture in order to put that back into the mould and coat it in resin. And as with the demon character, you'll recall that I covered that in parcel tape so that the monster clay didn't get stuck to the wood and the steel. So that's made that process quite easy, although it did take a little bit of effort to get all of that monster clay back off the armature. Right, there we go, so I can now put that back in my mould and then pour some resin in. So what I did with this was to pour some slow cure resin in initially, and that would go into the thin part at the end of the piece. As things started widening up as we get towards the base of the tentacle, I started using rotocasting resin, so that would stick to the outside and give me a bit of a cavity. I also sort of chucked in anything I had, really, any resin that I had that was left over which I could throw in and that would cure. One thing I found was if you mix Fuller's Earth, which is a type of powder, with resin, it will actually sort of bubble up in a kind of a, you know, a polyurethane foam kind of a way. Maybe that's how they actually make that stuff properly. But that was quite good because it meant that the volume of it was much higher than just straight resin. So I tried a bit of that as well. It looks a bit horrible, but it doesn't really matter, it's on the inside. So there we go, so I pulled the mould off there and there's my piece. As with the demon character, there's a little bit of cleanup required, but here's the piece all put together, and as you can see that's looking pretty decent, I think. One thing that I realised once I'd got this all done is that I think I got the angle on the arm wrong. Now, when I initially made this, I'd made an armature for the arm, which was grabbing the angel's leg. And because I don't have a welder, I kind of literally just had to sort of glue it and bind it together with steel wire and so forth. but it wasn't quite as strong as it should have been, so I knew fairly early on that I'd have to remake that, and I did. I made it out of some pieces of steel and bolted those together, so that was pretty strong. But because the previous version was a little bit weaker, the angel was sort of moving slightly in the pose when I had that. And once I put the replacement part in, I realised that because the angle of the armour had changed, the pose of the angel had changed. She was just a little bit too sort of straight, I thought, and I wanted her sort of leaning back a little bit more as though she were mid-flight rather than sort of almost standing up. So I realised that if I wanted to correct that, what I would have to do is actually smash off some of the epoxy that I put over the steel armature and actually heat the steel back up again with a blowtorch and bend it. Now that was a bit of an undertaking in the sense that I wasn't sure whether the heating up the steel would damage my sculpture, and obviously I'd spent quite a lot of time doing the hand, doing the leg and all this, you know, so it was a bit of a sort of a tense moment, shall we say. And actually it was quite interesting to see how strong the epoxy actually is, because I'm whacking this with a hammer here, and as you can see it's still taking quite a battering. It took me quite a lot to get this off, so that does sort of speak volumes about how good a material this actually is for sculpture. But nevertheless, once I got that off, I could then blast it with the blowtorch, heat it up enough to allow me to bend it. This actually took a couple of goes. I didn't want to go overboard with it, but after a couple of goes I got it about right, so I was happy with that. Right, so now that I've got that into a more or less finished state, I can now come onto painting. So what I'm doing is to give this a layer of undercoat, and as with everything, it's always nice to see how the undercoat sort of ties all those pieces together and sort of helps make it look like a fully realised piece. Now for this one, I'd got a bunch of paints from Scale 75, which are really good because they give you like a range of colour gradients that you can use. So I've got like a brown base there, and you can sort of build that up into flesh tones. So I found these really useful in painting this, and I was trying to avoid using like washes or airbrushes and things like that, and sort of actually physically painting in shading detail and gradients and things. So really just try and make an effort with the paint job here. So I'm sort of taking my time here and sort of slowly building this up. And I'm pleased to say it actually came out quite well, I thought. It looks a little bit weird here initially. Obviously, without a bit of red in it, it looks kind of dead and not particularly alive. But you know, you sort of slowly build these things up and it starts coming to life after a while. Also, I wasn't quite sure where to go with the colour scheme here. I didn't necessarily want to do it all in brown. It's a steampunk character, so that's all you naturally would go for. But I thought, well, I'll try some blues and, you know, lighter colours here. But actually, it ended up looking like she was wearing jeans, which wasn't really my intention. So I ended up getting away from that. But I did have a brown coat, so I spent quite a lot of time, you know, shading all that in and making sure there's a variation in colour for that. So yeah, the jeans didn't really work, so I'm trying some different colours here. I went for darker colours, but in the end I just ended up doing it all in brown. I've got quite a lot of different browns, luckily, some quite orangey ones and some very dark ones, so actually there was enough variation in colour there to make it register and read well. So I can now move on to painting the demon and the column of arms. Now obviously this is quite a complex shape and it's quite big, so this took quite a long time. But I'm just airbrushing on some flesh tones initially, and I'm just trying to build this up into something that looks cool. You know, there's a lot of sort of bloody detail. I want this to look organic and gross, so yeah, I'm just trying to sort of slowly build this up, add in a lot of variation in colour as well. You tend to think of organic things as perhaps being just red, but actually there's lots of different colours, blues and greens in there as well, so I'm trying to sort of just give it a variation and make it look natural. Also using lots of oil washes as well here to get into the details and try and make those stand out. What I also wanted to do was have a lot of fine vein detail in there as well, which really helps give it that organic look. So I'm just using a small paintbrush to brush in some veins into there as well. And I've done this in a variety of colours, doing it in blues and reds, and really helps give it a bit of variety. You can then go over those with some washes, and it really helps give that sort of translucent look that you sometimes get. Alright, so there we go. So that's looking pretty good, I think. So one other thing I mentioned, obviously, is that this is made in sections, and I did that for a variety of reasons. I'm anticipating on taking this to some events, hopefully at some point, show it to people. So I need to be able to get it in the car. So for that reason, this all comes apart. So as you can see here, here's me putting it together. And actually, the column of arms will actually come off the base as well. That's held in place by some bolts, so I can take those out if I need to as well. All of the arms are held on with magnets, so they're separate too. So I really made an effort to make this modular, and so it's transportable, and obviously it's quite big, so I don't think I can necessarily have it out permanently at home, so it's going to have to go in the loft at some point as well, so being able to take it apart is a real benefit. But anyway, that's it for this one. Thank you very much for watching. This has been a very long time coming, so I'm very pleased to have it finished. If you got this far, thanks very much, and I'll see you in the next video.